Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 80th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning. It's a pleasure to see you.
Good morning. Very nice to see you. Thank you for coming round.
And we're picking up our exploration of the Truss premiership, and today will really be the second episode in looking back at it. And in our first podcast on it a few weeks ago, we basically reached the end of the mini budget. And I had a long list of questions to ask you we couldn't get round to, one of which was going to be, hasn't Kwasi Kwarteng behaved well? Because he's not said anything at all about what's happened since he left government as Liz Truss's Chancellor. Since then, he has given an interview. He's really said, rather like Simon Clarke in The Critic this week, that somehow Liz Truss started from a position of preparing for the tax cuts she'd promised during her leadership campaign, then went to a position of delivering far more on borrowed money, which basically didn't work. Do you think Kwasi Kwarteng still behave well, and do you think that account is convincing?
Yes, I think he's behaved perfectly well. I think Kwasi and Liz have behaved very well under what must be very trying circumstances. Inevitably, there would have been discussions over the summer about how far things were going to go. I don't know how far it was the Chancellor driving things, how far it was the Prime Minister driving things of the time. I wasn't in the room. Inevitably, when things don't work, people hope that history will think that it was the other person who decided it all. But I simply don't know what the ins and outs were. Is the analysis right that if none of the other things had been added on, it would all have been fine? I don't know. What we were discussing last time is how much of it was in fact the responsibility of the Bank of England because of the failure to match the Federal Reserve's increase in interest rates, which I still think was fundamentally important. It was fascinating that the biggest hoo-ha was over the 45p rate, which was the smallest bit really of the whole thing. So what the specific proximate causes were, I think it's difficult to establish. But I think once it had been done, actually the U-turns made it all worse. And that once it had been done, it was important to bring forward the next stage, the spending cuts that were going to come and the supply side reforms, to try and build the package rather than start unpicking the stage one.
Is there any way the U-turns couldn't have happened?
I thought cutting the cut, reversing the 45p decision didn't need to happen. It didn't make any difference to the markets. It didn't make any difference to the budget deficit. It was a trivial rounding error in the government's accounts. All it did was show that the government was not firm of purpose.
We don't know. We probably can't say what brings the markets to make their collective decision. And it would be more rational, I suppose, to assume that the markets were frightened perhaps by the sheer scale of the energy intervention. It's the largest sum. You're just talking about the size of sums. But rationality in politics isn't everything. And the 45p did seem to become a token of what the markets believe was an irresponsible package. Yes?
Well, what the markets think is always very difficult to pin down, because what the newspapers report is what they think makes a headline rather than what the market is concerned about. It seems to be very unlikely that the market was in any objective sense worried about £1 billion here or there. You're right that the energy package was much bigger, and the market seemed to didn't seem to be worried about the energy package. But I think if instead of, and you know, it's all easy to say now, but if instead of saying the 45p decision's being reversed, we'd said there are savings coming of X billion pounds, that would have been a much bigger reassurance of the market. And some of those were really easy to come up with. They were continuing with the 91,000 reduction in civil servants and pushing through on a let's spend government money efficiently mantra.
So in fact, what you're saying is there was another way around the 45p tax cut issue, rather than just pressing ahead with it. If you'd have found some commensurate savings.
Yes, there are U-turns and there are U-turns, aren't there? That there are occasions when a government needs to do a proper, straightforward, full U-turn because things have simply gone wrong. There are other occasions when governments don't need to do a full U-turn. They just need to get to where they're going in a slightly different way. They need a diversion rather than a U-turn. And I think getting the spending and the supply side reforms in line would have been the diversion, would have got us away from worrying about the tax reforms.
I'll come back later, I hope to anyway, to supply side reforms. But I think we've cleared that up. I think it's evident from what you said last time we had a Moggcast that your view isn't simply the Truss government announced the right tax cuts package and should have pressed ahead. It announced the right tax cuts package, but there should have been commensurate action on the spending side, which there wasn't.
Or there should have been commensurate changes to the tax code. See, one of the things I thought would be sensible to do was to remove some of the allowances. Now, some of them I was actually advocating removing the working from home allowance, which is costing an increasing amount of money. We actually want people to be getting back to work. You see, we've got always to learn the right lessons from what's been done before, not just the headline lesson. And one of the things that has worked in tax reform is simplifying the tax code by cutting rates and cutting allowances. There's an allowance for printed papers for professionals, which is worth about £250 million a year. Why not get rid of it? And I think this was a missed opportunity. I was in favour of an effort to have a general simplification rather than just headline tax cuts. I wanted headline tax cuts, but more had to be done with it.
I mean, to be vulgar about it, you're in favour of what I always think of, rightly or wrongly, as the Andrew Neil tax package, which is you get up in front of the House of Commons and you say for half an hour, I'm going to abolish this relief, that relief, the other relief, cries of horror from around you. Then at the end, you say with a swirl of the magician's gloves, and income tax is now going to be 10p the pound or whatever. That's the deal.
That's the deal. That's really exciting. And that the markets, I think, would have worn and would have lived with.
But essentially, really, you were pushing this on your own because it had not been part of the Liz Truss leadership election campaign manifesto.
No, that's right. I mean, and I can't claim that I was giving a full list of all the allowances that you could get rid of. I suggested a few that you could have then turned into a simpler tax code. And our tax code is too complicated.
Can we now come to the fracking vote? Because I, last week, at a Conservative Home event, found myself interviewing Graham Stewart, the Climate Change Minister, and, found myself reflecting on the fact he was the minister at the dispatch box who was handed this note saying this is no longer a free-line whip. There's then this chaos in the lobbies with the chief whip and the deputy chief whip. What happened?
And this is one of the most puzzling parts of the whole story, because I think it was also the point at which there was no return. I think it was not easy at that point, but the chaos that the message from Downing Street caused was considerable and frustrating, because I'd spent all day working with the whips, which I'd never done before. And I was very impressed by how the whips machinery operates. So what was happening? Lists were being drawn up of MPs who were concerned. The whips were speaking to some. The ones who were most concerned were speaking to me directly. I worked very closely with somebody who's a great friend of mine, godfather to one of my children, but we are on very different wings of the party, in the form of Simon Hoare. And I basically ran everything past Simon Hoare that I was going to say at the dispatch box to see if this would ameliorate the problem with people like him who were concerned about fracking. And if you look at the vote, almost everybody was on side by the end of it. And so a lot of work had been done to line things up. And then a quarter of an hour before the vote, randomly, for no obvious reason, the rug was pulled. It was suddenly...
do we know who issued this?
I don't know where it came from. I didn't even know it was happening, because the wind-up was being done by Graham, not by me. So the note came directly to him to say, you must say this. But nobody told me, and I'm not sure the chief whip knew either.
It could have been an error.
Could have been an error?
We simply don't know.
But it was...
I should say to listeners, I've not yet read, these books come thick and fast, Harry Cole's and James Heal's account of what happened. It may be the answer is in their book. I don't yet know. It may be shameful that I don't know. But it is one of the great mysteries of the whole story, isn't it?
And then people are saying to me, is it a vote of confidence or not? And I said, well, as far as I know, it is. I leave the chamber, go to the whip's office to find out what on earth is going on, to be told that the chief and the deputy chief have both resigned and nobody knows anything. By which time the vote's already started. I mean, it was...
Would you have resigned if you were the chief whip?
Chief whips can't resign, really.
And she didn't, in fact.
And she didn't. I mean, I'm afraid if you're the chief whip, you are the captain of the ship in this sense. You cannot resign having taken on the job of chief whip. Your job is to get the government's business through, and you have accepted that your individual views on things are secondary to that role.
Just to pick up one point you made that interested me very much, you said you'd never had to work with the whip's office in that way before. Of course, you had been leader of the House for a long time, but you hadn't had to as the head of the department.
That's right. And as leader of the House, I worked extremely closely and very much enjoyed working with Mark Spencer, who I got on with extremely well. But I was never treading on his toes as to, I mean, occasionally you'd be asked to ring somebody up for a tight vote. But as leader of the House, that wasn't your main responsibility.
What do you think the Truss premiership will be remembered for?
Well, I mean, it will be remembered for being the shortest premiership in British history, beating Canning. That one has to be realistic about what things will be remembered for. I mean, you can make the case that the Boris premiership will be remembered for some really important things, and I think this case will be made one of the most important brief premierships, Brexit, COVID and Ukraine, three really big things. But in 7 weeks, the only thing of note is the brevity of it.
And let's think wider for a moment. There was a controversy during the Truss premiership about some of the language that was alleged to have been used by sources within Downing Street, and there was an investigation. I don't think the investigation found anyone at fault. But although some curious things turn up in the media from time to time, it did seem some pretty odd stuff was coming out of somewhere. So Saljid Javid was described as S**T at his former job. Michael Gove was described as having a darkness about him. Now, I don't want to ask you who is responsible or whether you think it came out of Downing Street or sort of somewhere else. But assuming which I think is correct in this case, that it's all not made up somewhere, isn't there a kind of deteriorating culture of discourse inside the Conservative Party that's become more and more evident in recent years? And aren't we seeing that at present with these rebellions all over the place about this and that follow rebellions all over the place about this and that in recent years?
Look, I think these sorts of discourtesies are a grave error. They're not that new. You will recall John Biffin being referred to as a semi-detached member of the cabinet, and that briefings were given about who was about to leave the cabinet, even in Margaret Thatcher's day, before they did. And I think this is really bad practice. I think long has been. I don't think I ever brief against colleagues. And we've had lots of conversations, but I avoid saying disobliging things about other MPs and ministers that I wouldn't say in public. I mean, if I disagree, that's different. But I think this type of briefing to the press that X is doing this and Y is going to be out is very bad for government. And it's true of all governments in recent decades. And the people who do it, and you can't blame the journalists. That it's very easy to say, oh, the journalists just make it up. They don't. When they say a Downing Street source has said X, it will be somebody who works in Downing Street. And it won't be somebody very junior. It will be somebody who has an authority to say something. They won't be getting it from the policeman on duty. Not that he's junior in a particular sense, but they won't be taking it from the policeman on duty. They will be taking it from somebody who has the authority to say it. And this has been very bad for politics, and causes division within government that is quite unnecessary.
That's very clear. Let's just now move from whatever's briefed to votes. Do you think there's an out-of-control culture of rebellion?
Look, I think if the Conservative Party wants to win the next election, we have to support our current leader, and we therefore have to vote for what he puts in front of us, unless it is something that singularly disadvantages one's own constituency. So if North East Somerset were to be turned into a car park for Bath, that would be different, or is of major constitutional importance if the Prime Minister suddenly decided that he wanted to resurrect David Cameron's reform of the House of Lords. I think unlikely, but I'm concerned that people are voting on things that are against the government, that are on the routine business of government. And I think one owes the party leadership support on the routine business of government. And people need to remember from 1997 that people thought by showing how independent-minded they would help themselves in their own constituencies. If anything, they did slightly worse rather than slightly better. That you don't help your own seat by making life difficult for the government. You just make it more difficult for everybody. And so I think these rebellions are ill-advised. Are they out of control? You've done the studies, you've reported on the studies that rebellion has been getting bigger since the 1950s and seems to be getting further and further. It is harder to stop under current circumstances for a number of reasons, partly the mandate. The mandate is important, and the mandate was Boris's, and therefore it's hard to turn around and say, you must vote for this because it was in the manifesto, when inconvenient bits of the manifesto have been jettisoned. So there's the authority isn't great, so Tory MPs have of their own volition to come to the conclusion that they want to win the next election, therefore they should support the government.
Well, mention of Boris Johnson's premiership really will take us to the next Moggcast, as that's the next aspect of recent history we're going to explore. And I think we'll return to this question of the culture of the modern day Conservative Party then. But this has been a fascinating Moggcast as ever, and thank you very much.
No, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.